It appears that after a long period of escalating tensions, the Trump administration has signaled a desire to de-escalate with a 15-point plan aimed at ending the conflict with Iran. However, instead of opening a clear diplomatic way out, this proposal raises a question. Is this truly a peace solution, or merely a form of ultimatum packaged under the guise of negotiations? While Washington asserts that ongoing contacts are effective, Tehran has flatly rejected this, claiming that no negotiation process exists. This contradiction not only reflects the trust gap between the two sides, but also reveals the complex nature of so-called negotiations during wartime. A close observation of the content shows that the 15-point plan proposed by the US shares many similarities with peace frameworks seen in other conflicts, where one side imposes structural conditions on the opponent. But in the case of Iran, demands such as the total abandonment of the nuclear program or the restriction of military capabilities touch directly upon core issues of sovereignty and security. Therefore, Tehran's refusal was almost predictable. This highlights a notable reality. When one side calls it negotiation, but the other perceives it as coercion, the possibility of achieving substantive peace remains very distant. Delving into its essence, the so-called 15-point plan put forward by the Trump administration is not simply a peace agreement in the conventional sense. It resembles a comprehensive restructuring project for Iran rather than a two-way negotiating framework. The core conditions revolve around forcing Tehran to completely give up its nuclear capabilities, cease uranium enrichment, dismantle key facilities, and place the entire program under international supervision. Beyond that, the US also demands limits on the ballistic missile program and the severance of ties with regional proxy forces, tools that Iran has traditionally used to expand its strategic influence. Viewed as a whole, these are not terms aimed at ending the war, but rather at changing the way Iran exists as a regional power. In other words, Washington and its allies are seeking to root out what they consider long-term threats, an Iran with nuclear potential, a regional network of influence, and independent deterrence capabilities. This aligns perfectly with the strategic logic that the US and Israel have pursued for years, not only preventing Iran from possessing nuclear weapons, but also reshaping the balance of power in the Middle East in their favor. Consequently, Iran's reaction is almost predictable. The first issue lies in the matter of sovereignty. When conditions are presented as must-do rather than negotiable, Tehran sees imposition rather than dialogue. In fact, Iranian leadership has long viewed US proposals as a way to impose its expectations rather than solve problems. In the current context, with hostilities ongoing, accepting such a package of conditions would be tantamount to admitting strategic defeat. The second issue is the calculus of deterrence, a vital factor for Iran. For a nation that has repeatedly faced military campaigns and sanctions, nuclear capability, even at a potential level, the missile program and the proxy network serve as a strategic shield. If they agree to abandon these elements, Iran would essentially lose its long-term self-defense capability. Conversely, if they prolong the conflict, they retain their leverage, albeit at a cost. Therefore, Tehran's choice is not just war or peace, but losing or maintaining deterrence. Another noteworthy point is the internal factor. Sources indicate that Iran's current stance is tougher than before, with counter-demands for the US, such as war reparations or the withdrawal of forces from the region. This reflects the rise of hardliners within the Iranian political system, those who have never trusted negotiations with Washington. In the midst of being under attack, no administration easily de-escalates, as doing so could be perceived as weakness before an adversary and cause domestic instability. From here, a larger issue becomes clear: the strategy of negotiation through pressure that the US is applying. In theory, combining military pressure with diplomatic proposals could force an opponent to concede, but in practice, this approach harbors many risks. First is the risk of escalation beyond control. When both sides are fighting while talking, any mistake on the ground could collapse all channels of dialogue. Second is the risk of misinterpreting strategic signals. The US may believe that offering a proposal is a sign of goodwill, but Iran perceives it as part of a pressure tactic. Conversely, Iran's military actions may be interpreted by Washington as escalation, while Tehran views them as defense. It is this misalignment in understanding that causes the gap between the two sides to widen. And finally, there is a more dangerous scenario. When pushed too far, Iran might fall into a state of having nothing left to lose. Historically, such situations often lead to high-risk decisions or even sharper escalation to break the deadlock. This is particularly concerning in a sensitive region like the Middle East, where a single miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction. In summary, the US 15-point plan, in terms of structure, is not a balanced bargaining platform, but leans heavily toward imposing a new order on Iran. And when one side sees coercion instead of opportunity, a rejection is not surprising. The problem lies in this: if both sides continue their current approaches, one exerting pressure, the other resisting, the line between negotiation and confrontation will become increasingly blurred, and the path to true peace will become even more remote. Looking beyond the negotiating table, the impact of this 15-point plan does not stop at US-Iran relations, but is spreading across the entire Middle East in ways that are difficult to control. The Gulf region, which has tried to maintain a balance for years, is now nearly pulled into the vortex of conflict. Countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE initially sought to stay on the sidelines, but the back-and-forth attacks have forced them to bolster their defenses and even coordinate more closely with Washington. Notably, this is not a proactive choice, but a mandatory response when their energy security and infrastructure are directly threatened. At the center of all concerns right now is the Strait of Hormuz, where approximately 20% of the global oil supply passes through. Even a minor disruption here causes the world energy market to reel immediately. Reality has shown this. Every statement regarding negotiations or escalation causes oil prices to fluctuate sharply in a very short time. At times, oil prices dropped immediately after the US signaled dialogue, only to bounce back hours later when Iran issued a denial. This reflects a clear reality. The market does not react to facts, it reacts to expectations, and expectations right now are extremely fragile. Beyond oil, the entire global financial system is in a sensitive state. Investors are having to price in geopolitical risks at higher levels, while energy supply chains, already under pressure from previous crises, continue to be threatened. A prolonged conflict in the Middle East, especially if it involves the Strait of Hormuz, could create a domino effect, impacting everything from fuel prices and inflation to monetary policy in many major economies. On the other hand, the United States itself is not immune to these impacts. In Washington, the narrative is no longer purely about foreign strategy, but has shifted into an internal political issue. President Trump's approval ratings are under pressure as fuel prices rise and anti-war sentiment spreads. US political history shows that Middle East conflicts rarely bring long-term benefits in terms of public opinion, especially when they carry clear economic costs for citizens. When gas prices rise and inflation is pushed up, arguments about strategic security become harder to justify in the eyes of voters. A notable point is the growing contradiction in the US administration's messaging, wanting to project a tough stance to maintain military superiority while simultaneously signaling a readiness to negotiate to reassure markets and public opinion. But this two-faced nature makes it difficult for both adversaries and allies to predict. For Iran, it is a sign of pressure. For the market, it is a sign of instability. For American voters, it may be a sign of a strategy that is not yet truly clear. From all these factors, it can be seen that this 15-point plan exists in a very peculiar state. It is simultaneously a diplomatic tool and a strategic lever, yet it is not yet truly a foundation for peace. It can be understood as a move to increase maximum pressure, forcing Iran to choose between concessions or continued losses. But conversely, the all-or-nothing structure of this plan makes it difficult to accept from the very beginning. Ultimately, the most important question remains Washington's true motive. Is the US seeking a viable peace solution, or is it pursuing a deeper objective to weaken Iran to the point where it can no longer challenge the regional order? If the answer leans toward the latter, then the 15-point plan will not be the starting point of peace, but perhaps just one step in a longer-term strategy. In that case, any negotiations, if they occur, will only be part of a power play, rather than the end of the conflict.